Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy days and schedules to be here with us today. My name is Danielle Ragib. I am a training and technical assistance specialist with the Center for Applied Research Solutions. I am also working on the Medi-Cal Mobile Crisis Services benefit. You all are familiar with the benefit and the requirements of the benefit. So we are here offering one of the core trainings. This is number 2 of the core trainings that focuses on trauma-informed care. Today we have Eve Fitch and Ariana Mellinger presenting on how our brains respond to stress and trauma, connecting with people in crisis through a trauma-informed lens. Today we are really excited to bring to you Eve Fitch, who has a master's in social work and over 27 years of experience working with children, families, and first responders. Eve has expertise in critical incident and trauma services and currently works with the Columbus Division of Fire Rapid Response Emergency Addiction Team, also known as REACT, with 2 R's, and provides services to families who are impacted by substance use. Eve provides brain-based trauma-informed training for first responders and the community. Eve also has a certification in Bruce Perry's neurosequential model for therapists and educators through the Neurosequential Network. We're really excited to have Eve today. We also have Ariana Mellinger, who is a licensed chemical dependency counselor in Texas, and also a person who identifies with lived experience. Ariana was the first youth peer support specialist at the Harris Center in Houston, Texas, and one of the 2 peers with the Mobile Crisis Outreach Team. On that team, she worked with youth and young adults ranging from 12 to 21. The youth she engaged with struggled to get their mental health needs met in a traditional setting, leading to involvement in multiple systems and often out-of-home placements. Ariana shares her lived experience in the areas of mental health, substance dependence, and the criminal justice system. She strives to make an impact on lives by inspiring hope and teaching skills to help anyone navigate the road to wellness. In February 2023, she was offered a licensed chemical dependency counselor intern position, where she's at now, with the Community Health Corps in Longview, Texas, while she works towards earning her full license as an LCDC and continues her studies to complete her bachelor's degree in social work. We're really excited to have Ariana and her experience and expertise here today. And I'm actually going to reference a few things. As you all are aware, or maybe not, there has been a new BIN released, a Behavioral Health Information Notice 23-025. We are going to go ahead and put it in the chat for you, just in case you haven't been able to reference it yet. And there's been some updates to the BIN based off some of the feedback that was received when the BIN was open for comment. And we are also placing in the chat the document that was released by the Department of Healthcare Services that kind of highlights all the changes, key updates to the BIN, so that it makes it a little bit easier to follow and really find out where the updates have been. Again, mobile crisis response services through this exciting new benefit have defined mobile crisis services providing rapid individual assessment and community-based stabilization to Medi-Cal beneficiaries who are experiencing a crisis. I'm going to go on to the next slide. And again, you've probably all seen this slide before if you've been in the past few trainings. This exciting new benefit really is working towards transforming how we deliver mobile crisis services here in the state of California. And we're seeing this as a national transformation as well, right? The new direction is really for mobile crisis services to be more resolution focused and really work at the forefront to provide relief to people in crisis in the community and help keep them safe in the community while using the least restrictive means necessary. Again, mobile crisis services should be person-centered, trauma-informed, equity-driven, should focus on brief intervention and de-escalating and resolving any crisis in the field as much as possible, and working from a lens of the least restrictive interventions, meaning we're really navigating away from law enforcement, psychiatric hospitalization, emergency department use, and things like that. We also want to make sure that all services are culturally responsive, linguistically appropriate, and accessible. And I'm going to pass it on to Ariana.
Good morning, everyone. So our learning objectives today, we're gaining towards describing the impact of trauma that it has on individuals, families, their bodies, their minds, their relationships, demonstrating key tasks in delivering the new Med-Cal mobile crisis services benefit, and summarizing key trauma-informed research studies detailing trauma across the lifespan and the impacts it has on developing in the brain, reviewing the 4 R's of the trauma-informed approach. So part of the next part of it is going to be at the conclusion of the training. We want you to be able to learn the impact of trauma-informed care through a person-centered and family approach, identifying signs that one's own trauma response has been activated in the field, and understand lived experience with lessons from the field. So part of this training can be extremely activating for others, and also recognizing that we all live with our own trauma, whether it be inside of the field that we're experiencing it, being on webinars, or anything like that. We also encourage you to take time for yourself if you're having any of these activating thoughts, and just remember that it's very common to experience these things while in any space.
So this is a definition from SAMHSA, and it's describing what is trauma. Trauma is an emotional and psychological response to an event or circumstance, such as loss, injury, abuse, living with someone who has a mental, physical, or substance use disorder, discrimination, poverty, and natural disaster. So trauma is an umbrella term that encompasses what lots of folks would consider 3 major types of trauma. And that first is intrauterine insults. And while, look, we don't always have the ability to assess how someone's mom's pregnancy went, but we have the ability to maybe think about this as a response to what we're seeing in terms of behavior. And so some of those insults can be a mom who is experiencing domestic violence, a lack of housing, food insecurities, that is, really maybe has had some physical difficulties like illnesses. Those things can impact that developing fetus, and especially the brain of that developing fetus. I think we're all aware that substances and alcohol can impact that brain development of a developing fetus. And we see that and can see that in long-term behavior. Some of them, sometimes those things can get mitigated over time with the right kind of interventions if we're seeing things that we think or suspect might be related to an intrauterine insult. And then we might delve deeper and ask about what that pregnancy was like. Event-based trauma. And I think this is the one that most people think about when they think about trauma, that this is something that has really impacted someone, and it can have long-term effects, and they can certainly be activated based on the experiences that they've had. So a car accident, sometimes it's natural disasters like fires. And I'm thinking folks in California know what that might be like. It can be an event like a significant loss of a loved one, or of a neighborhood or a home. So that's event-based trauma. And again, I think this is what most people think about when we consider people being impacted by trauma. And the next one is a little bit more complicated, and that's complex developmental trauma and toxic stress. I think this one is really significant. This is trauma that happens on a daily basis, reoccurring with lots of frequency, unpredictable by nature. So an example would be folks that are living in neighborhoods with violence or homes with violence. This would be experiencing those microaggressions on a daily basis. What we've learned about microaggressions and outright racism and prejudice, especially in statements and words, is that they really include a lot of humiliation. And research has really shown that when folks experience humiliation, their body, the chemicals and the stress response in their body is more significant than if they experience physical assault. So complex developmental trauma and this toxic stress is something that is incredibly impactful, and it's impactful to all of us. I'd like you to think for just a moment about what the toxic stress is about the work that you do, right? Having done mobile crisis response in my history, I think of the things that were incredibly toxic and stressful for me, or thinking about the safety of the call, thinking about the volume, how much time do I have? Do I have the right resources that are going to support this? Those things, if we are not present in terms of resources, can increase our toxic stress and increase that response in our body. And if you think about that in essence of the folks that you'll be working with, other disciplines, first responders, people in the ER, as well as the folks that you are responding to, it's really important to think about and maybe just question, what are some of the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis, and how might that impact their behavior? So everyone's affected by trauma. It has no boundaries. It's not age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Again, no boundaries. And it's experienced by both adults and children. It's important to recognize that although it can occur at any age, it's particularly debilitating, has particularly debilitating long-term effects on children's developing brains. So if you were to go and Google, you would be able to look at some brain scans of children who have what would be considered kind of a normal upbringing versus those who have experienced some trauma or neglect. And when you do those side-by-side comparisons, you can see significant deficits in the brain scan. Now, those can be improved with the right interventions. And that's kind of the crux of today, is to make sure that we're able to really provide some of those interventions that can really help to mitigate those long-term impacts of trauma on a brain and on our behavior. So mobile crisis services can support an individual or family member's resilience while mitigating the long-term effects of trauma. And we're going to talk about building skills of resilience later in this presentation. So I would ask you to pay kind of close attention to that, because you will be able to build that into your service and really help to utilize those skills of resilience as you think about good, concrete, collaborative plans. So we have a lot of people on here. It's pretty difficult to unmute and get some comments, but I would like you to think about these questions. And if you would, maybe put some things in the chat when you think about and look at these questions. So how does understanding trauma and all the ways it can manifest benefit mobile crisis responders? So I'm hoping some folks can put some things in chat and we can discuss it a little bit. How does understanding trauma support the person in crisis? How does understanding trauma support family members and loved ones, right? Or support school and group home staff? And how does this knowledge translate into mobile crisis team practice? So Heather puts in better understanding of what the person is feeling and what they need. Right. I mean, if we can recognize that trauma is impacting the behavior that we're seeing, we get to use strategies that will help us and help that person, right, to manage in a different way.
I find that that's why it's so helpful also in the peer role of having those peers on mobile crisis outreach teams, of understanding both like the clinician role and the peer role, in that sense of saying maybe this clinician might not understand where the person is coming from in one aspect, but the peer could. A good understanding that could be like in my own instance in the field of having interactions with law enforcement. So somebody sees law enforcement, and one of the policies in Texas is that they have to have handcuffs on them whenever they're having interactions with them. Well, the clinician was directly behind the law enforcement. And I said, well, that's probably not the best place for them in case this person feels unsafe and feels the need to run. So understanding those things too, whenever we're in the middle of scenes, can be important as well.
Thank you. Really good examples. Awesome. Well, I'm going to move on because we have so much to cover in terms of content. You will get copies of these slides. I know that you don't have them now, but you will get them. And so I'm hoping that you will take an opportunity to go back through and look at them and really consider these questions and think about truly how you can put this knowledge into the work that you do. I think being trauma informed and being trauma competent, in my view, are two different things. We can be trauma informed, but when we're trauma competent, we put that into our actions and how we put it to work. And that's what these questions are really asking us to think about. How do we take the information that we know about trauma and apply it to the work that we do? So my expertise really about understanding our brain and how it responds to trauma and how it responds to stress. And so we're going to talk about the brain. It is this very complex organ. Neuroscientists would even say they know a fraction of what it's capable of, right? So we're going to talk about how the brain develops and then what parts of the brain control what behavior that we have. Why is that important? If we recognize that this brain is in controlling everything that we do and experience, right? And if we understand how it is developing, we have an opportunity to consider, is this appropriate developmental behavior based on age and when I know that this part of the brain is developed? Can I help this person be able to respond from another part of their brain that has more ability to provide rational thinking? So that's why it's so important to understand this information. So much of what we're going to talk about when we talk about brain development, stress response, the sequence of engagement, really comes a lot from Dr. Perry's work. If you're not familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, He is a physician and a scientist who has studied the early impact of trauma and to children's brains, and then has been able to think about ways that we can mitigate some of those experiences for not just children, but adults. So he's really a fascinating individual, and I encourage you to look him up. Yeah, so this is the sequential development of the brain. And we're going to start down at the brainstem because it is the first and most significant part of our brain that's developed in utero. So the brainstem controls everything that we don't have to think about. It controls our body temperature, our respiration, our breathing. So this information comes through our brainstem, and we develop from our brainstem, moving up all the way to the cortex. Information comes in and goes through the main brainstem, and then kind of branches out into all of these other parts. Now, look, I'm a social worker, so we're talking about this in simple terms. There's lots of other parts of the brain, but I'm going to talk about just these 4 parts because they are so significant. And they really are significant because these are the parts that are impacted when we experience stress or trauma. So the next part of the brain that gets developed is our midbrain, or the diencephalon. That midbrain really controls our digestion, our sleep, but more importantly, it controls motor regulation. So it controls movement. So, interestingly enough, it's mostly highly developed during toddler years. So if you think about what toddlers are doing, you can really understand how this is being developed in those toddler years. They are learning to pull themselves up on the coffee table. They're learning to walk. They're learning to feed themselves. They're learning to talk eventually, right? So those are all things that happen in our toddler years. And this is when this part of that brain is being highly developed. Now, when we move up into the limbic, that's the part of the brain that controls our emotional reactivity, our sexual behavior, and our attachment. This part is developed during adolescence, right? And so we can picture, right, adolescence. We know that during adolescence, that shift of being attached to family is now really focused, and peers become incredibly important. Family's still important, don't get me wrong, but this is about exploring those attachments outside of family, right? And it is that emotional reactivity. The other thing that's interesting about this time is that the brain has a lot of activity during our adolescence. And so it's often a time of creativity that we often fail to tap into. I know personally, I can think back my own teenage years, and during that time, I played 4 instruments, I wrote in journals, and I wrote poetry. If you asked me to do any of those things today, I wouldn't be able to do them, right? I lost that ability, sadly. So I think it's an opportunity for us to think about how we tap into that creative nature of adolescence, and challenge folks when we hear, that statement that says, "Oh, you have a teenager? I'm so sorry. You're going to have 5 more years of hell." Language matters. That matters to young people. We should challenge those statements just like we challenge any other statement about discrimination or about bias. So there's my plug. It happens to be the population that was my favorite to work with I haven't worked with them recently for a long time, but I really enjoyed working with adolescents. I had worked at a youth runaway shelter for 5 years, so it was awesome. When we move up into the cortex, that's the last part of our brain that gets fully developed. And that's the part of our brain that controls our abstract thought and problem solving, right? And it also important, our values, our principles. And it is not fully developed until mid-20s. We don't actually know when it gets fully developed, but we know that it's not at 18, which, is what we all consider adulthood. And so when we have an expectation that an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old has full ability to have that abstract thought and problem solving, we need to step back and say, perhaps not. And this is my opportunity to use coaching and mentoring to help develop those skills. So we're going to talk next about stress and how our brains are impacted by stress. And there's three, stress is not a bad thing. We need stress to be able to accomplish our tasks and to get things done. But that's that positive stress that's brief, and it has mild evolutions in stress hormone levels, and it's pretty predictable, right? We know that we've got a task to accomplish, and yeah, we're stressed about it, but it's all predictable. Then we can have tolerable stress, which is a little bit more serious. It's temporary. And more importantly, it's really buffered by supportive relationships. Connections and relationships are really key to helping that stress be more tolerable. This is another reason that peer support specialists can be so helpful in a situation, because they're often able to really empathize and really begin that supportive relationship with folks.
I also think it's important, Eve, to look at the relationship that you might have with your supervisor as well, whenever it comes to these stress levels, and to really be able to check in with supervisors whenever you're going out on calls as well, to check in with how you're doing with the stress of the scene and how you're dealing with the response in yourself.
I love that you brought that up, because I also think it's the use of your teammates, right? That you have teams of folks that are responding, so that relationships makes the stress more tolerable, right? So using those relationships is really key. And then that toxic stress is prolonged activation of a stress response system. And it is in absence of a protective relationship, right? So these are unpredictable things that happen with regularity that activate our stress response. And then it is, again, in the absence of protective relationships. So we're going to spend some time talking about the stress response. And this is really talking about what part of our brain is activated when we are stressed, when we are feeling any kind of threat, right? What part of the brain responds, and what does that look like? And so this time I'm going to start, rather than that arrow goes from the brainstem to the cortex, I'm going to start at relaxed, which is really having full access to your cortex, right? And remember, the cortex is that part of the brain that has abstract thinking. You can do future planning, that all of those things. Now, Bruce Perry would say that in a relaxed or calm state, you only really achieve that when you are in isolation. That you have full access to all parts of the cortex, when you are alone and in isolation. Not forced isolation, but when you are by yourself. And when I think about this, I can recognize that I do a lot of future planning and problem solving in the shower. There's lots of that rhythm and repetition of that shower and the water allows me to have full access to my cortex. I solve all of the world's problems if only anybody would believe me or listen. Now, when someone comes into your realm, you become engaged. And every time you move from one stress response to another, your heart rate goes up a little, right? So in engaged, that's when you are in kind of with other people. You have to be engaged to learn new things. I'm hoping you all are in an engaged state right now. The things that are rewarding to this part of your brain, because you have access to the cortex and you have access to the limbic when you are in engaged. And what's really rewarding are to really have those conversations with folks about the things that align with your values and your principles, right? That's being engaged. Now, when you move down into an alarmed state, your heart rate goes up. And if you look across from alarmed, you only have access to the limbic and the midbrain. You no longer have access to that cortex or the rational thinking part of your brain. And so, again, your heart rate goes up, and the things that are the most rewarding to folks that are in alarmed are things like promiscuous activity, sometimes illegal activity, driving fast. Those are all things that really are rewarding to an alarmed state, as well as fatty, salty, sweet foods. Now, I think that's really interesting. And there's theories that the fatty, salty, sweet foods are nourishing your body to prepare you in case you need to fight or flight. And when I think about those days that I've been stressed, and I may have spent a lot of the time in alarmed, I can recognize that, you know what? I want chips and salsa, right? I work with a lot of first responders, and one of the captains said, yeah, when they would get back from a tough run, the thing that he would always reach for was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And it's recognizing that, again, you don't have access to that rational part. You only have access to that part of the brain that is controlling your emotion and your movement. Now, folks who have experienced a lot of trauma and adverse experiences in their life spend about 80% of their day in alarmed. Those of us who have not had that experience spend only 20% of our day in that alarmed. So think about an increased heart rate for 80% of your day, not having access to a cortex, and what that does to your ability to learn, to work with others amicably. It has a huge impact. Now, when you move down into that fight or flight, that is when you have a perceived threat, and your brainstem, which controls everything, is saying, wow, you're not safe right now. You either need to fight, flight, flee, or fawn, right? Those are those responses. And you only have access to that part of the brain that controls movement, which is the midbrain. So if someone in a crisis perceives that police officer that's been called as a threat to them because of their past experiences, or perhaps because of what they've seen on TV, their brain can automatically go into that fight, flight, or freeze, right? And so they only have control of the midbrain, which again is that movement, and will impact especially folks who are engaged with someone that is in that stress response. Really need to be thinking about strategies to help someone get back into their cortex. And we're going to talk about giving you some strategies for that a little bit later.
I also find that it's important to think about whenever being called, the fear of the unknown to the individual that is experiencing the call, of telling their information to clinicians, telling their information to people that they don't know. That's part of that alarm state of saying, like, I'm not sure where this information is going to take me. I'm not sure where what's gonna happen to me, and being very aware of that whenever they're telling you what's going on.
Thank you for that. Our brains want predictability. That means safety to us, right? So we need to really consider, right, that we provide that predictability. Now, what's rewarding to that really is to kind of step back and kind of really remove what you can identify as what's activating that, right? If you have the ability to remove what's activating that, that will then help someone kind of move up in armed and then hopefully back into an engaged state.
And so something I found that's worked for me before is just telling the person what's about to happen before it does. Saying, like, these are the reasons why I'm asking these questions, these are the reasons why I would like to know this information, and then telling them what would happen with the information afterwards.
Awesome. Absolutely. Again, it's that predictability that really helps. And I think utilizing peer supports to help kind of give that predictability, give that empathy, helps to build that relationship that allows you to think about helping them to get back into a part of their brain, and especially that engaged part, because you can't do planning with someone who's not an engaged start, right? They don't have access to a part of their cortex. You need them there to do really good planning. Now, panic, I'll be honest with you, I don't think I've ever truly seen anyone completely in a panic state. I think I've seen it close. But panic is when that person's brainstem completely takes over. And so they don't have the ability to communicate. They are in a fetal position, making guttural sounds. And truly, the only thing that's really rewarding then is to really just step back and watch for them to come out of that panic and into, again, a fight or flight, better yet, an alarmed, before you begin to engage with them. So I've thought a lot about this, and I had a recent experience that I was really down in that fight, flight, or freeze. And I think I want to mention too, and before I tell you my story, I think it's really important to recognize that we often think of people that are acting out, that are, angry, making lots of, punching walls, really escalated, that those are the folks that are in that alarmed or fight or flight. But truly, you can be in a depressed state and still have that reaction and be in that alarm or fight or flight phase. So we need to be able to say, and look at the behavior and recognize when we're seeing them in a part of their brain that doesn't have the ability to really have access to any part of their cortex. So I have this really big dog that I'm terribly attached to, and he's terribly attached to me. And I walk him off leash, but when I go to my sister's, he's normally on a leash. But I let him out of the car, and he was behaving. But he saw people arrive that he knows that were across the street, and he started to run towards them. And he was running in between two cars, and I could see a car coming. And I knew that that car was going to hit him, right? And I am not the person you want to be around when I'm in that fight or flight, because I froze. I had that freeze response. I dropped to the ground. I was sobbing instantly. I didn't want to see what was happening. I heard the thump and I was devastated. Well, so I'm on the ground in this really fight or flight part of my brain. And here comes my big dog, like looking, he's right in my face. Like, what are you doing on the ground? Are we playing? What's up? He wasn't hurt at all. He's big. And the car had slowed down enough that he just bounced off. I was a mess, I bet, for a good 2 hours after that, because of the chemicals that had gotten pumped into my body, that adrenaline, all of those pieces and parts that were controlling that fight or flight, which the midbrain controls. It took a long time for that to dissipate. So keep that in mind when you're working with folks, because that stuff doesn't just dissipate from your body right away. It lingers. So here is, whoops, I think. Here is a piece that Dr. Perry talks about pretty extensively. And it is what he would call the sequence of engagement. When you notice that someone is down in that midbrain, limbic part of their brain, that you need to help them regulate first before you ever are going to reason with them. So you regulate, then you use your relationship, then you can begin to reason. So I want you to just think about crisis situations. And I know I have worked in a mobile crisis. I managed a 24-hour crisis site. And I know the sequence that frequently happened when someone would come in was to go right to an assessment, right? They would begin to ask that person all of these very personal questions. So, have you thought about killing yourself? Have you thought of how you would do that? They are appealing to a cortex that potentially that person has no ability to have access to, right? We have to step back. We have to regulate that first. More importantly, we have to regulate ourselves, right? We get anxious. We get nervous. We hear that this is a combative person, right? That they are highly escalated. We start to think about all of those scenarios, about what that means. And I'm going to tell you, 2 dysregulated people are an explosion. We have to take the time to regulate ourselves before we step into that environment, because we won't be any good to that person. So think about, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that later in the presentation, but it is incredibly important that you really think about ways that you can regulate your own stress system, because then you'll have a better opportunity to help others regulate theirs. So I'm curious, again, if you could put some things in the chat, that would be awesome. Based on what you've learned so far, what do you anticipate an individual might be experiencing as we engage?
I find it important to think about like what we're reading to, as you mentioned, Eve. As we're reading the port, we're going to the wherever we're headed, and think about how long the state has been over the time of just getting there. Like things can change so very rapidly, and to go in with an open mind of that person might have already regulated themselves. And so whenever you get into the scene, not to go based off of necessarily always that it's chaotic, but keeping an open mind and always assessing your area as well of like, hey, this is not at all what I just read on this piece of paper, because things change very rapidly.
Oh, they do immensely. Good point. The other thing with this second question, it's almost in almost all crisis episodes, there is an elevated stress response that is separate from the individual's chronic condition or diagnosis. I think if you all have watched Cappy Madenwald's presentation, I believe she talks about getting to the true essence of a crisis that sometimes has nothing to do with a chronic condition or diagnosis, right? But if we don't take the time to really get that person in that calm, regulated state, that we will never really learn what that true essence of the crisis is, right? So we need to be thinking about that, watching for it to change. I mean, truly, that is absolutely the case. I know that sometimes folks would be transported to our crisis site, and they had been incredibly agitated before they got transported, but the very act of transportation regulated them, right? And so we have this, regulated person now in front of us who had been incredibly dysregulated. And yet we fail to really acknowledge that and really help to educate folks about that piece, that, wow, just that transportation helped to kind of calm the situation. That's awesome. We can really help people by helping them to understand their stress response, understand that what happened to them to get them back into that calm state. And we're going to talk about the importance of rhythm and repetition later in this presentation.
I also found it important to think about, like, when's the last time that they had something to drink? When's the last time they had food?
Yes.
And that can be part of regulation as well. We used to keep water, we would keep snacks, and be like, if it was the lack of food that started the initiation, then just having something as a simple gesture of food, of a snack, can help regulate the person to where they're
Absolutely.
able to do a full assessment as well.
Absolutely. When I working in the crisis site, and people would be like, they just come here because they want a sandwich. I'm like, okay, they want a sandwich. That's great. Give them a sandwich. There was a question here that I think would be really thoughtful for you to consider, Ariana, and that was, what happens when someone is under the influence?
Right. And so when somebody's under the influence, sometimes they're just not present. It depends what kind of substance they're consuming. It depends what they've had, but also from what I've seen in my experience, they're more likely to act on thoughts of wanting to hurt themselves whenever they've consumed a substance. So it's really important to listen to them, listen to what's going on, and think, is this person in immediate danger? So if they are, then to find what's safe in their environment and see how you can disrupt that and make sure that they're safe for that immediate time. Sometimes substances don't always, and this is controversy, Sometimes substances don't always mean that they're highly intoxicated, like marijuana. If they just have a little bit of it in their mind, it might be helping them to cope. But in reality, it's actually increasing it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So anything else that's significant that you all can think of here? Someone was talking about Maslow's hierarchy. Absolutely. And I think that this last question or this last consideration also is, you need to really consider how you help not just the person in crisis, but the family in crisis, right? There will be family members who will benefit from you being able to give them strategies about how to calm their own stress response, because this is not just stressful for the person in crisis. This is stressful for the families that are maybe present. So think about how you can help to calm not just that person, but the families as well. It's the challenge, right? Oftentimes I think I'm pretty sure you'll go out in teams while I'm asking that question. I know other places really make sure that folks go out as a team, so that you really can divide sometimes as need be to help provide that regulation for a family member, while someone else is helping to do that regulation for the person in crisis.
And as you mentioned that, I think that's really effective with peers is if you, especially with youth, if something has escalated between a parent and between a child, then you can really help kind of separate the situation of taking the child into one area and the parent into another until you're able to regulate and then bring them back for the assessment.
Yes. So I'd like you to think of a time when you responded to a person in crisis who experienced a traumatic event, or even think about a personal experience of crisis. Did you observe any fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response? Fawn is that response when folks just kind of acquiesce to anything because they're avoiding conflict, right? They're going to do anything you say because they don't want to have any conflict. Because I didn't talk about that fawn response with the fight, flight, or freeze. I'm sorry. What were the short and long-term results of that experience? How did that impact the person, family, or community? Consider the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual effects. If you put some things in the chat, that would be awesome. I think one thing to consider when we're thinking about this is that, a lot of times folks don't recognize that the behavior that or the emotions that they're experiencing are related to a trauma or something that they've experienced, right? We had an example of a teenager that we got called to the school to do an intervention on. She was having some suicidal ideation and had been really withdrawn and not really engaging with folks, and saw a real drop in grades and a drop in, she'd kind of dropped out of some certain things. And we had a really awesome clinician who really spent time with her and got to know her and talked with her and learned that she'd had this very traumatic event at school about 3 months prior, that she had gotten hit by a bat during gym accidentally in the head, which had lots of blood. The emergency squad had to be called. She was transported to the emergency room and stuff. And so the clinician thought that her experiences recently might be related to the trauma, because she had identified that she kept, what she was saying was having daymares. that she was really reliving that event on a daily basis. And so we made some referrals. She did some therapy related to that event with eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and really had some very good recovery after that. So it's really paying attention and asking questions, because she never would have made the connection that her recent depression, her recent suicidal ideation was related to kind of that event. So we need to ask.
I find that being the importance of education to the client, to the person experiencing the trauma, especially in my own lived experience. If I've had education provided to me during those times, then I could say, okay, then I understand that this is a normal response. But a lot of the times, youth and even adults might say, like, what is going on with me? Like, this is abnormal.
Right. Awesome. Absolutely. So these just a list, not comprehensive. I'm sure you can probably think of things that are not on this list, but really gives you an idea of the types of dysregulation you might see, both that dissociative or disassociation and the hypervigilant. Because as I said, I think we recognize the hypervigilant dysregulation more than we recognize the disassociation, but they are both equally important for us to consider and to keep an eye out for, right?
Just like the person earlier had mentioned, the substance use is here in the dissociation.
Yes, absolutely. So just some things to consider. And again, I don't think it's exotic. This is not, you might be thinking of other things that you've experienced or seen, but it's just a list to give you some clarity about, again, what to look for, both in dissociation and when people are hypervigilant. You know, I mentioned how important it is for us to recognize our own stress response and what are the things that we do to kind of calm ourselves. So you can put in the chat box maybe the biological, physiological, social, and spiritual signs that you recognize or see when you experience stress. What are the signs that tend to show up first? What's hardest to manage? Who tends to notice those signs first, you or someone else? And then if you have thoughts about how do you ground yourself and what kind of supports do you need at work and at home? Boy, you know, when I think about this, I had an experience in 2001. You know, I have been actively involved with a critical incident stress management team for over 25 years. I teach and educate on the signs and symptoms of trauma, right? I know them all. I certainly didn't know it when I was experiencing it myself. I had in 2001, which was, a bad year for a lot of folks. We had a local line of duty death, and I had been actively supporting not the police officers as well as the police officer's family during that line of duty death. Then there was a staff member at the agency that I worked with who was shot, critically injured while at work. And I was supporting his family while he was in an induced coma at the hospital. And I was watching his dog because they weren't able to. And then I ended up with that dog permanently because he was permanently blind from lack of oxygen to his optic nerve because of the loss of blood. So when he recovered, he was blind and couldn't take care of the dog. And so I was supporting all of that. And then at that point, 9/11 happened. And I did a lot of interventions with teams that had gone to New York City and were coming back. I helped at an emergency site the day of, And then in December of that year, I spent a week in New York City doing debriefings with New York police officers. We did 3 debriefings a day, as well as visit the site where they were looking for evidence. And so when I got back from that, we did some kind of debriefing ourselves, but I became incredibly mean. I don't know how else to put it. I was irritable. I was angry all of the time. I was snapping at people. I was a supervisor, a manager of a team, and folks were like, "Oh my gosh, Eve, this is not you. What is up?" And I had a brave coworker who would say, "Eve, you need to go talk with somebody. You have signs and symptoms of trauma. Go do something." So we have to be able to help others listen to folks as they recognize potentially that, you know what, things are just not right with you. And so, yeah, I think it's a good example of really being open and listening to other people, because I taught it, but I sure didn't recognize it in myself. So, anybody have ideas about how they ground themselves? What do you do if you're feeling yourself really getting anxious or stressed? Is there anything in particular that you found that is helpful for you?
I see Juliet in the chat talked about she grounds herself by paying attention to her own breath, wiggling her toes around in her shoes to feel that they're underneath her. And that's an amazing way just to kind of make sure that you're there to recognize what's going on internally inside of you.
Good strategies. So I'm going to share a funny one with you, and my nephews probably would hate that I'm sharing this with you, but I am a crier. I can see people at the airport saying goodbye to one another, and I would start crying because they're crying. But I did this crisis response, and I would go to people's homes who had just experienced an unexpected loss in their family. So of course they're crying. And I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to manage this? Because I can't be crying, right? So I have this picture of my nephews that I'm incredibly close to. They're twins, and they're about 3 years old, and they're in ballet leotards with Barney slippers on, and they're making big time wrestling poses because they thought that those leotards were big time wrestling outfits, not ballet leotards. And they're making these goofy faces. So every time that I would go into a situation when I knew that I might really be impacted and I might have emotion, I picture them, right? That's the picture in my brain so that I can have some control over my own reaction and experiences. I've really learned that that's helpful, a helpful story to tell to people, and to tell to even folks that I work with kind of in a therapeutic way, because I get them to think of things that give them joy, make them laugh, make them smile, and say, you know, put that picture on your fridge. Think of that picture when you're really in beginning to feel yourself feel stress.
I see people saying that doing check-ins with themselves, doing video games. And I think that's important for me. It was always music in between calls to making sure like I would sit there and listen to something and kind of give myself a break until the next call.
And I think it's really important to be able to communicate what support you do need at work and at home. Communicate that to your teammates, as well as to your families. Because here's the thing, when trauma is unaddressed, it increases the risk of mental health disorders, substance use and chronic physical issues. So we really need to be mindful of how we begin to manage, because it's not just, remember, it's not just that event-based trauma that we're considering. We're experiencing that stress, everyday stress that we have impacts our body in a negative way. So we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences. And I'm hoping that you all have some familiarity with this study. The ACE study, it's becoming, I think, more and more folks are knowledgeable about this study. It is incredibly, it just gives us a great picture of how that stress, how those adverse experiences impact our bodies in a negative way. So it's the largest study that it's ever been done that examines the health and social effects of adverse childhood experiences over the lifespan, and has had over 17,000 participants. And it is these two physicians, Folletti and Anda, who did this study. So we're going to talk about it. I'm hoping that you have seen it. I will give you one suggestion. If you don't know much about this study, there's a really great TED Talk that you can access by Nadine Burke-Harris. She is awesome. It's not long. She talks about it. It's really good. So that might be an option for you to take a look at if you don't know much about this. But basically, these two physicians were initially on opposite ends of the country, doing work with one, and I can never remember which one, so don't hold that against me. One of them was working with obesity and noticing that he would have some folks who had great success in losing weight, but then would kind of gain that all back. And on the other end, that person was working on smoking cessation and having the same experience, that people would stop smoking, but then all of a sudden they'd start right back up again. And so they were wondering what might be contributing to that. Would there be things that we should be considering? And they kind of got together and they came up with these questions that had to do with abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Only 10 questions, so that it was not a lot. They asked about physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. They asked about physical and emotional neglect. And then they asked about the household dysfunction, mental illness, incarcerated a relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Now, go ahead.
Sorry. I find it important to educate people too about the potential risks, anybody that you can, because eventually if they see signs, then they can get the person into interventions and treatment faster than later. Because if they see these things, then they say, okay, well, this person could be at risk for these things.
Absolutely. Very good point. Now, I want you to consider the two physicians working on obesity and smoking cessation. These were mostly white, middle to upper class folks. And they were asking these questions of them, even though they were there for their weight and their smoking. So as a consequence, I think they recognize that, folks may not have always been truthful about how many of these experiences they've had, because you're thinking, what the heck does this have to do with me trying to lose weight, right? These are pretty personal questions. So we have to keep that in mind. But what they learned is pretty significant. They learned that there were risk outcomes. The more adverse experiences someone had, they began to see an increased risk. That there were, things that really contributed to their overall health in a negative way as a result of adverse experiences. And so out of 100 people, if you look at this slide, and the one that's the most significant to look at is that far right-hand column that says with 7 or more ACEs. And remember, folks probably weren't completely honest, so they may have actually had more than 7 ACEs, right? That with 7 or more ACEs, that they are more likely that 1 in 6 smoke, 1 in 6 are alcoholic, 1 in 30 use IV drugs, 1 in 6 has heart disease.
So with this information, I find it really important for people to look at. A lot of people would educate others on the genogram model for a long time, and the genogram doesn't really give you statistics like this, right? So it doesn't really tell you like these could possibly be the outcomes of
Right.
what could happen. If somebody in my own experience would have told me this, it could have been preventative of like, oh, hey, these are the things I could watch out for, versus like in the genogram, these are going to potentially be you. So it's more specific into like what could happen to you.
Yeah, very good point. You know, Heather asked about if it's been the study's been done with specific populations, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that this study has been replicated numerous times with numerous different populations with the same outcomes, which is pretty remarkable. And again, when you consider that this is the largest study of its kind, it really has some significant impacts to all of us if we really pay attention to it, right? That's the big if. Because I think this next slide, I think is really important to consider. These are the health conditions that are correlated with adverse experiences. And so when you look at the increased percentage, heart disease, stroke, cancer, COPD, I want you to consider this particular list. You know, if we think about adverse experiences, not just adverse childhood experiences, and we think about the folks that we're going to interact with, in particular first responders, who have a vast amount of adverse experiences potentially every day. And these are the things that are killing our first responders. These are the diseases and the health conditions that are killing our first responders. And so the key here, we talked about that stress response, right? And the one thing that I didn't mention, I did briefly, was that we have this flux of chemicals that get pumped into our bodies when we have a significant stress response. So every time we have an adverse experience, we're getting those stress chemicals pumped in, and it's impacting our overall health in a negative way.
So, and I really want to kind of highlight on that last slide of seeing the difference in between somebody with 0 to 3 to 4 or more, and how drastic it changes.
Yes.
So whenever you're interacting with families, to really keep that in mind of like, these are the things that could be potential referrals as well.
Right. Absolutely. So this represents and really illustrates that, you know, there are other things that impact our early death, that it is not just adverse childhood experiences. And at the base of this pyramid, it talks about generational embodiment and historical trauma. So significant. We need to recognize that. What are we talking about when we talk about generational embodiment and historical trauma? We're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about those marginalized populations who experience things as a result of that put them into social conditions that impact them in a negative way, such as poverty, housing discrimination, redlining, Jim Crow laws. All of those are social conditions that impact folks in a negative way. And so the thing that's really significant about this, and one that we have to consider, is that we've learned that trauma lives in our DNA, that we can pass our traumatic experiences on to our offspring. So think about that when you think about slavery and the experiences of our Black and brown populations that they've had historically, and then think about why there may be responses that they have that we might not have as, or I might not have as a privileged white person. So, people of color living in the United States with high ACE scores have as much as a 20-year shorter lifespan. Pretty remarkable when you think about that. I have to say that when this has been a newer slide for me, and my agency began to talk about the impact of historical trauma to early death. And it really made me think of my husband's family. My husband was a Black man. He was a Vietnam vet. He died at the age of 72. As did 3 of his siblings. He was one of 8 children. And of all of those 8 children, 4 died before the age of 72. The other 4 still living have all of those other complications. One has cancer and has diabetes. The other one had colon cancer and had a heart attack. And the 2 younger brothers are impacted by substance use disorder. And I got to thinking about the stories that Harry would tell me about his growing up, being profiled, the microaggressions that he experienced, the microaggressions that I would see him experience when we were together. And I thought about how that activated his stress response, right? How that impacted his body in a negative way. And I had to think about, so did that contribute to their early death? I don't have the answer to that question, but in my heart, I believe that it contributed.
And like you, Eve, I saw somebody comment, even so-called privileged white people suffer high ACE scores. I feel like it's in socioeconomics and rural communities and things like that as well, because the lack of resources, the lack of information that gets out to the rural communities. You have to think, like for my own example, I experienced high ACEs because of both of my family members being incarcerated, both my mom and my dad, both having substance abuse around me, and the rural community having tons of substance abuse, having divorce. So as our generations progress, these are more common in everyday culture.
Absolutely. And look, I'm not discounting that privileged white people can have high ACE scores, but what we know statistically is that, and we're going to talk about that. Maybe I'll just go on to the next slide, because I think it's in this next slide that will demonstrate what I want to make a point of. Here we go. This is the health disparities data. And that's why I think it's really important for us to understand that children of different races and ethnicities do not experience ACEs equally. That 61% of Black, non-Hispanic, and 51% of Hispanic children have experienced at least one ACE, compared to 40% of non-Hispanic children. That there are other people who experience as ACEs, right? But and who have low incomes, but it's the marginalized populations who also really struggle and have a greater propensity for those adverse experiences. And I want you to remember or think about when I talked about, so in particular, gay, that LGBTQI community. Think about the microaggressions or outright aggressions that those folks might experience, and know that many of them have an element of humiliation, and know that that engages a greater response, negative response in their body than if they were physically assaulted. So this is really significant information for us to consider. So there is compelling and consistent evidence for a graded relationship between ACEs score and juvenile justice system contact in the United States. So when you do, and when you explore those folks that are in the juvenile justice system, many of them have elevated ACE scores. So how can you use this information to help support those in crisis?
I find it important to look at what we look at as crisis as well. A lot of people don't consider having interactions with juvenile justice as crisis in the beginning, but it starts in the schools, like we saw. It starts in the grades, and you start seeing the progression and bullying and things like that. So then there comes the interaction with juvenile justice. And there's so much impactful things that can come out of changing the context, and instead of them just being bad kids, supposedly, to changing it of like, what happened to you? What's going on? How can we help? That can change generations.
Very much so. I think some folks had put it in the chat back in the beginning about Dr. Perry's book with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You? And I think this is exactly that issue, right? That in the school systems, in our communities, in our work environments, when we see a particular behavior, rather than saying, gosh, what is wrong with you, right? We say, what happened to you?
So this is what led me to want to be a peer and want to do the work that I do in crisis. Is in the rural community where I grew up at, it was always like, well, we're going to punish you for ISS. We're going to do this. And not a single provider ever asked what happened, right? What's going on. They said, well, we're just going to give you this punishment, move on. And there was no true connection.
And that's the significance, right, of how we put this information to work, right? We can't assume that the behavior we're seeing is intentional bad behavior, right? We need to really think about what happened to that person. Where is this behavior coming from? And how can I help them to have a different response in a different situation? Right. It's important to recognize we don't want to take away their survival skills, because some of those things have been survival skills for them. We don't want to take that away, but we want to be able to educate them about when it is appropriate to use that skill and when it's not.
Using it as a strength base.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, recognizing that and really begin to ask those questions. And that's how we can really put this information, I think, it gives us an ability to help support those in crisis in a better way. I was looking at the chat a little bit. Yeah, it says in my experience, most of the people have had some trauma. I think when you consider some of the data, you can pretty much assume that the people that you're working with or that you are responding to have had some adverse experiences or trauma in their lifetime, right? And so begin to ask that question. So this behavior can be a result of those experiences. Again, in absence of looking at the behavior as a result of their diagnosis, right? That may not be the case. It really may be as a result of the experiences that they've had.
In my case, as a person with lived experience, mine, after years of looking back, all of mine were in direct result of all of my ACEs that I experienced.
Yeah.
And I found that hugely phenomenal of a point when going back in therapy.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So, we know that trauma has no boundaries, but we also need to be able to recognize that it does have a disproportionate impact on those marginalized populations that we talked about, such as LGBTQIA, people of color, and people with low incomes. And that the gaining of trauma-informed resources and care is much more difficult for those populations, right? When you have a choice about seeking care versus I need to be able to support my family, sometimes the family comes first. And that's because of the poverty, because of the situation that they're in. So it is important for us to really recognize that it is really difficult for those populations. And it's even greater when you consider that intersectionality and the combination of social locations like age, gender, identity, race, so forth. And again, this is the largest ACE study to date. It's been replicated a number of times. And here are just some data. 61% experienced at least one ACE. 16% of adults have experienced 4 or more. And remember, that's probably underrelated because that's really personal questions to ask. Women and several racial and ethnic minority groups are a greater risk. Preventing childhood trauma could result in the prevention of, this is what is most important, could result in the prevention of 1.9 million cases of coronary heart disease, 2.5 million cases of obesity or overweight, 21 million cases of depression, 1.5 million students from school. If more people understood the impact of this study, we would have greater prevention opportunities in our community, because this is costing, we have to talk about cost. This is costing our communities a lot of money to manage all of these health concerns. Here's the important part: they're not destiny. We can do things that will mitigate. And what we're talking about is building resilience. And we've talked about this. Resilience are those protective factors that counter the risk factors endangering our health. Now, look, there's lots of stuff about resilience out there, but if you do the research, these 5 skills of resilience pop up all of the time. And so they are absolutely intertwined. You utilize one skill of resilience to build the other. And these are the 5 skills of resilience that I really want you to consider: a sense of hope, sense of perseverance, moments of success, self-regulation, and connections to community.
And I want people to really realize, as you have peers on crisis teams and things like that, the sense of hope is a really huge deal of incorporating the peer into your mobile crisis outreach team, to be able to provide that maybe one day that person can possibly go into it, especially as we look at juvenile justice. A lot of people use condemnations, negative ones, thinking like they'll never succeed to anything because they've caught a felony or such things like that. But providing them the sense of hope that their background, their experiences do not have to become their future,
Good
that they
point.
can persevere.
So if we have the ability to help folks build these skills of resilience, right? Look, we'd like to not have to build resilience at all, but the reality is that we have an ability to give them some strategies that will help them build these skills of resilience. And this is helpful for us as well when we think about our self-care plans. How do we build our own skills? How do we build these skills of resilience within ourselves? Now, look, when we started this, I really struggled with that sense of hope. I think peers are excellent opportunity to help people understand that there can be hope. But I felt like, oh, that's kind of a nebulous idea. How do I help somebody build their hope? So I found this great article that said there are 8 ways to increase your hope. And I realized as I looked at them that they absolutely are utilizing the other 4 skills, right, in order to increase your hope. So if you're looking back at past wins and you are really being able to celebrate those wins, right? That's a celebration. That's recognizing when you have those positive wins. That's using that skill increases your hope.
Right. And looking at also, a lot of people can't see it within their own. I look at it as a picture frame. Like if you're in the frame, you can't see it within yourself. You have to have outside help in order to help your perception of building that hope, especially with people who use substances. If you've quit using a substance and you exchange it for another, then the strength of that is that you've done it before.
So you've used perseverance, right? And you've been able to, do that once before. So let's, consider that you have the opportunity to do it again.
Right.
The peers are able to really instill hope in others, talking about their own experiences, which does give them that hope. Looking for the third door is really using that perseverance. It is that, look, I could wait in this line to get into this venue. That's one way. I could go up and pay the doorman $20 to see if he'll let me in, or I can go around to the back staff door to get in. That's looking for that third door. Really looking for and using perseverance. Filtering your inputs is about really that self-regulation, right? Pray or meditate. Both of those have elements of thankfulness. And we know that when you express thankfulness to others, it increases your happiness and increases your hope. Create if-then scenarios. That's about using that perseverance. If this doesn't work, I'm going to try this. Frame your failures as feedback. The others that, really when we go back and look at those skills, in particular, sense of hope, perseverance, and moments of success are all a part of that building that sense of hope. That self-regulation is that ability to manage stress. What do we do to manage that? And then connections. We are wired for connections. So how do we build connections to the community? How do we build connections to others? This is such an important one, but we often fail to do that as crisis workers. How do we get them connected to people or to communities?
And I feel that it's by being out in the community yourself, by knowing your resources around you, by looking at free alternative things that they can do that are creative that they like, and knowing those activities, such as if there's an art show and an art festival, to really encourage them, hey, this is where you could really find that creative outlook, going out and doing something different without having to spend money.
Absolutely. I have worked in the youth field, and I don't know if folks are familiar with the wraparound. And this has been years ago, but there was an agency out on the West Coast that was doing wraparound, and they had a supervisor that said, look, if you're not doing your services out in the community, you're not really doing services. And so she would instantly put folks on suspension if they had people come into their agency to work with them. She's like, oh no, you need to connect to the community so you can model how that those families get connected to a community. So
Right,
you're
because
right.
you become reliant on you to do everything, and then you never teach them how to do it themselves.
Absolutely. So it's incredibly important. So how do you think that these skills of resilience can be integrated into crisis intervention and planning? Got thoughts about that?
So some things that I think about too, whenever I think about some things that have worked, especially in crisis situations, of one thing that was always super effective of if a child or a youth was on a bed and they were telling me what was going on, maybe sitting on the floor. So things like that of making sure that I'm on their level, making sure that I'm meeting them eye to eye. Those things really connect with people whenever, especially with families, when you're bringing them in, sitting at the table with them, not putting them in uncomfortable situations of saying, this is your home. Where would you like to be?
Yeah, good points. So how can you put these skills, what things can you do as a part of a discharge plan, as a part of a crisis intervention? What are things, because really, when I talk about these 5 skills with families, they're like, wow, I can do those things. I may not be able to get my child to a therapist once a week, but I could get them and introduce them to our local library or take them to the rec center to get connection. I can help them figure out what are things they could do to manage their stress, because I need to learn that so we can learn it together. They are much more hopeful when they look at that list because they're like, oh, I can do those things.
And instead of providing the numbers of like on paper or something to have them put it in their phone at that time. Most individuals have cell phones now. And so you can just say, hey, let's program it together right now. So that way you have somebody to directly reach when in crisis.
Right. It's very easy to lose a piece of paper. It's not so easy to lose that list on a phone. Good point. We're going to start talking about person-centered and family-centered trauma-informed care in mobile crisis response. Again, if you've not seen the presentation by Cappy Madenwald, I really encourage you to do so, because hers is really awesome as she talks about that person-centered and what that really means. But you know, it really is about providing care that focuses on the person and the family. That this is building rapport and trust so that you can collaborate with folks. At the very forefront of every crisis interaction is that rapport and trust building. And it is activity that has to be ongoing throughout the intervention. I think sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge. These are SAMHSA's 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach. Why do I think that sometimes this is a challenge? We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about some important neuro connections that we make. So neuro connections, if you don't remember, are things that happen with enough repetition that we actually form what's called a connection in our brain, and we have neuro pathways. Well, here's why I think person-centered approach can sometimes be difficult for those of us who have worked in the field for a while and who also did a lot of school and training that taught us that we are the experts. We know best. And so it makes it very difficult because we've made a neuro connection in our brain. We were taught over and over again that medical model that says, you know what, that psychiatrist, he's at the top of the chain and he makes he knows best, but after that, I know. And so we're going to make decisions for folks, not necessarily with them. We have operated with that neuro connection for years. So we have to form new ones. We have to really work hard to say, you know what? The folks that we're working with are capable, competent, and able to collaborate. And so we really need to kind of shift our own thinking so that we're able to do that successfully. So these 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach, starting with safety, this isn't just about physical safety, this is about psychological safety as well, right? That we have to provide environments where everyone is feeling that safety, not just the folks that we're working with, but that we are working within our own agencies, our own organizations have to have safe environments for all folks. That we really create atmospheres of trustworthiness and transparency. Again, using those peer support specialists is so crucial. But when we think about trustworthiness and transparency, we need to, make sure that, we don't make promises we can't keep. We don't know that when we go into a situation, we can't promise somebody that we're not going to end up at the hospital. You don't know that when you start out. Don't make that promise. You can say things like, you know what, I'm going to do my very best because I know that that's not what you want. We're going to do our very best to make sure, see that won't happen, but I can't make promises, right? So, and then follow through. If you say you're going to do something for somebody, follow through with it. That's what creates that trustworthiness. And I think Ariana really talked about this earlier, that transparency, telling folks what's going to happen, telling them about what's going to transpire. That's the transparency that creates the trust. And this whole new model and this whole really thinking about how we approach mobile crisis response from a person-centered approach, peer support specialists are essential to this. They really need to be an active and equal part of every team because they have an ability to be able to, really help build some of those skills that we talked about, build trust, and to help us provide a much better crisis intervention. Do you have thoughts that you'd like to add to that, Ariana?
Absolutely. I think it's important, like you were saying, Eve, earlier, to really recognize the person and how their support and how their expertise really plays into it as well, especially as you invite peers into those situations. Because sometimes I've heard people say, well, we don't understand what their goal is here beside us, but just really inviting them along, getting their expertise and learning from them and seeing who they are, what they bring to the team and what they bring to value.
Thank you very much. And this new person-centered approach is really about collaboration and mutuality. We're not making plans for folks, we're making plans with folks. This should be a very collaborative effort from everyone to come to a good resolution plan. And how do you do that? You do that through empowerment, giving people voice and choice. They need to be heard. They need to have choices. We need to be able to listen to that, hear what's important to them. And we need to consider when there are cultural, historical, and gender issues that are impacting our crisis response.
Right. And I think it's important to go in whenever you're thinking about that and asking that at the very beginning of, what is your name? What is your preferred name? What what pronouns you use. I find that builds trust and transparency as well.
Absolutely. And, even though we, you know, we don't know every culture, we don't know every, we don't know the experiences of every person that we've worked with. What I hope that you can do is recognize when it is impacting your ability to engage, and have trust, and then ask questions. I've noticed that this really was bothersome for you. Could you tell me a little bit more about why that is, so that I can really provide better care to you, right? Be humble and be curious.
Yes,
Ask
that's what I
questions.
was just about to say. Be curious in what their culture is, especially because then they want to tell you, they want to tell you about who they are, what they bring to the table, and what their goals, what their aspirations are as a person. And that really helps create that safety with them, especially.
Yes, absolutely. So these are the 4 R's of trauma-informed approach and how they support building responsive services. The first is really realization, and that is about folks really realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. And then that recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and that we ultimately respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. That's interesting. Sometimes organizations struggle with that. But then we actively seek to resist that re-traumatization. Again, if you've watched Cappy Madenwald, she talks about iatrogenic harm, right? And when we re-traumatize, we are really creating an atmosphere of iatrogenic harm. And that iatrogenic harm is when we are providing a service and we actually do more harm than good, right? It may not be intentional, but it happens. And this is a really common way that we have that iatrogenic harm, is by re-traumatizing folks, right? And so we really need to be able to manage and resist that. Asset-based language approach. What does that mean? There's an asset-based versus a deficit-based, that we really focus on the strengths, we explore opportunities, we affirm diversity, versus focusing on weaknesses, the inadequacies, and emphasizes the differences. Language really matters. And we have an opportunity to really educate and use language that allows us to bring that strength-based approach to a situation. Think about the words that we use that really have an ability to be deficit-based. I recently had an opportunity to get challenged about that term, case manager. And I'd never really considered it until they brought it up and said, when we talk about case managers, we mean that someone needs to be managed versus us working collaboratively with them. And I was like, you're right. We got to come up with another word. We kind of got to look up. And I hope you notice that Ariana really has talked about being activated versus being triggered,
Right.
because there are things that language makes a difference. And I know people are like, oh, you're just making a big deal, it's no harm. And no, it is harmful. It is very harmful. And we need to be open to hearing when someone says, you know what, that makes me uncomfortable. We need to be open to the feedback.
And also open to hearing new ideas from the person we're serving as well. Seeing what they prefer in that language is really essential.
Yeah, it is. And when we have that, we shift language from that deficit based to a strength based, right? We allow that to happen. But, again, when we think about those neural pathways that we have because of our training and because of that medical model, we often have to chart about a diagnosis in order to bill, which is really about looking at the deficit, not the strength, right? So there are parts of our job that make this very challenging to consistently stay on that strength-based approach, but incredibly important to do that across everything that we do. I'll never forget, my agency is really big about being strength-based. And we started working with the REACT team with the fire department 2 years ago. We were brand new to the team, and my coworker, so we were at our very first team meeting, and the captain started off the meeting, and he was starting to talk about kind of the challenges that the team had. And my coworker, it's like, excuse me. I was like, oh no, here we go. We're gonna be in big trouble. They're gonna hate us. But she's like, could we start with talking about some of the things that have gone right with the team rather than talk about, so if you embed that into your agency, everyone begins to think about and come to it from a strength-based versus a deficit approach. So
You have to shift the culture.
yes, absolutely. So these are components of successful person-centered and family-centered trauma-informed care that we, again, provide that psychological safety as well as physical safety for everyone involved, that we provide transparency around decision-making and relationship building that is focused on earning that trust, that we promote peer support and collaboration, that everybody has that voice and everybody has that input. Connect by listening to understanding, being empathetic, and building rapport. Spotlight a person's strengths, choices, and self-determination. And recognize and address historical traumas and cultural and gender stereotypes. So especially those that are impacting the family or the person that's involved in that crisis. I would add, if you look up Dr. Perry, he's got what's called the 6 R's. There's the 4 R's, there's 3 R's, there's all these R's. But the 6 R's for Dr. Perry is about kind of the optimal environments. And mostly he always talks about that in relationship to educators. But my agency has really begun to think about those 6 R's as it relates to our agency and how our agency can provide things that we know are really elements that help us all thrive. They are assuring that things are relevant. So how do you do that? I am sure you've all been in meetings before that have no relevance to the work that you do, right? Make sure that when you're going to invite folks, it's relevant to what they do. Let them leave when you get to the discussion about budget if it's not applicable for them. Make sure that things are relevant, not just for the folks that we're working with, but also for the folks that we're going to be providing crisis services for, that we make sure things are rhythmic. We're going to talk about why rhythm is so important. And, that's giving people opportunities to get up and move. Maybe it's a standing desk. It's a walking meeting, doing supervision while you're walking around the parking lot. Those are things that help to bring regulation. And that's the next one, that we we provide that regulation, that we have things that are repetitive because we need things to have that repetition in order for neural connections to be made. So we can't expect folks to just learn something by giving them information once. We make sure that we have it repeated over and over again, that we make sure that it's relational. Again, those connections to one another are so important. So how do we make sure that things are relational within our work environment? Make sure that it's rewarding and respectful. How do you know when rapport has been established? So these are just some things they express that through their own verbal expression, body language, engagement, sense of feeling respected and heard, that they've been a part of the decision making and then the safety planning.
And I feel like this is important as you look at whenever I was talking about earlier, like where are you providing this stuff, like putting them in control of their own assessment of saying this is the most comfortable area for us, things like that. And then you'll start to see the body language
Right.
shift and
Yes.
feeling respected and heard.
One of the biggest things that folks really identify that increases their stress and increases kind of that dysregulation, so to speak, is a loss of control. And most folks that are in crisis feel like they have very little control. And so some of your techniques, Ariana, give that control back. You can ask very simple questions. Hey, would you like to talk in here or in the dining room? Would you like to sit on the front porch or would you like to sit at the table? Those are questions that give some power and control back to the person that you're talking with. They seem so simple, but it can be incredibly successful in being able to establish that rapport and trust. So building rapport and trust requires validation, empathy, not sympathy, empathy, compassion, understanding, being authentic. And it must be about the person and family in crisis.
Right. And being authentic, making sure you're not going through the assessment like you're checking a box, but like you're actually, your care and concern is there in that moment and being present, like what Eve was talking about as well. Being present in the moment for you and for them and for your potential person that you're partnered with.
Yeah. And that means that you really listen to them and you really get to the true essence of the crisis. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing some consultation with a team and they were talking and they were frustrated because this guy would come in crisis. They talk to him, they get him to calm down, and they made all of these referrals. They linked him with psychiatry, they linked him with a therapist, but he just kept coming back. And it would seem like just when they would get ready for discharge, he would kind of dysregulate again. And they're like, we just can't figure it out because we made all of these great referrals for him. And I finally said, look, here's one thing I recognize about your team. You guys really build a rapport and a trusting relationship. Do you think that this guy is lonely? And they all kind of went, that perhaps the essence of his crisis was not what they anticipated, but that he didn't have good connections. And so they began to think about how they could help him connect.
And it's important to think about whenever you're doing those referrals and case management and stuff like that, having peers be able to go to the referral with them and making them feel comfortable, making them say like, okay, these are the questions that you ask whenever you're having consultations with therapists, whenever you're having consultations with whomever you're going to see, and having those warm handoffs to the next provider. Because if you're making them that comfortable, of course, that they're going to come back and they're most comfortable with you. So you have to have them be able to be comfortable in their next setting as well.
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned in the chat a while ago about those warm handoffs. They are so crucial, right? that you don't just give them a telephone number. You just don't say, okay, call, or, oh, look, I set this appointment up for you, so you go. But that you're able to help with that warm handoff. That maybe you know somebody in that agency and you're able to say to someone, you know, I've worked with this agency before. I really trust them. I think that they do really good work. And look, tell me what you're anxious about and we'll figure out how I can help you with that, because I really want to make sure you get connected. They are very crucial to that ongoing plan. Brief relief and resolution focused strategies. And we're going to talk about that importance of rhythm and repetition. Why is it so important to our own ability to self-regulate, and how can we use it in order to help others regulate when they are escalated? So here's the thing. The most important neuroconnection that we have ever made in our lives has been while we are in utero. And while in utero, everything that we experience is great, right? All of our needs are taken care of. We are safe. We are fed. We are not hot. We are not cold. We don't have a dirty diaper. Everything is copacetic, right? And we have that feeling of safety and security while we hear the rhythm of our mom's heartbeat. And we hear it a bazillion times while in utero. So we all gravitate to rhythm and repetition when we are trying to self-regulate. It's why if we were in person and I was looking out at people in a training, there would be people rocking. There would be people tapping their pen. There'd be people doodling, twirling their hair, maybe shaking their leg. All of those things have rhythm and repetition, and they're doing that to stay focused. This was just like an eye-opener for me. I was like, oh my gosh, now I know why some of the things that I did intuitively throughout my career worked to help calm somebody down. Now I can get to do them intentionally, right? It was like this light bulb went off. So I had the luxury, because I was the manager at the crisis site. There was a guy that was working the front desk, and anytime that somebody was starting to maybe get a little agitated, he'd find me and he'd say, Eve, Joe's getting agitated. Could you come talk to him? I'd say, okay, there's 20 other staff down there, but okay, I'll come talk to Joe. Well, what I would do is I'd go take Joe for a walk. And all of there with other people were like, you can't take him out of here, that he's going to run. Then we're going to have to call the police. I never had anybody run away from me, never had to do that, because I used that rhythm and repetition of our conversation and walking that helped to get him back into a more rational part of his brain. So we can use rhythm and repetition to our advantage in crisis situations. It's really important to think about, not only for ourselves, how do we bring rhythm and repetition for us to be more focused, but how can we bring rhythm and repetition to the folks that we're working with to help them get into that cortex or the rational part of their brain. One way to do this is to think about mirroring. Now, mirroring, our brains are really kind of wired for this. We kind of mirror what we see other people doing within 3 minutes. So you can give this a try. I've never done this. I'm going to promise I've never done this, but my coworker says she does this all the time. That she'll be in line at the grocery store and she will start swaying, because then she'll look back to see how many people behind her are swaying with her, because it only takes about 3 minutes for someone to mimic what you're doing. there's lots of science behind why that happens. Babies really respond to us because there's kind of some chemicals that are getting activated, pleasure chemicals that are getting activated through that kind of us gazing at them gazing at us. But think about how you can use mirroring to get someone to kind of be able to begin to de-escalate a little bit, right? I sometimes will even acknowledge or say, this really helps me if I pat my knees sometimes. So you might give it a try, see how it works. And I'll continue to do that, see if maybe they will begin to give that a try. That's mirroring. Now, the other thing that is really important to consider is co-regulation. All of these things that you see here would be considered co-regulation. It is walking. It is conversation. Conversation has rhythm and repetition. It is, being able to interact with others. The other thing that I want to point out outside of the folks that are kind of in that circle is that element of being in parallel. Crucial in a crisis situation. When you are working with folks in crisis, it is really important to do your best to stay in parallel, not a face-to-face conversation. Face-to-face conversations, especially for folks who have experienced adverse childhood traumas, really can escalate folks. But when you are in parallel, it reduces that stress.
One of my favorite ones in parallel is actually while sitting on steps and being parallel beside each other and them being comfortable in their surroundings is just sitting there having a conversation.
Yes.
On the steps, parallel, and being able to be fully aware of everything going on around them makes them feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that when I first started on the team, people would talk about transporting folks to treatment, because our team would engage people out in the community, and then those folks might call our team to say, I'm ready to go to treatment, and they'd go pick them up and take them right to treatment. And they were like, we've noticed that when we pick them up, we learn their life story. Like, they may not have opened up to us before, but when we get them in the car, man, we can barely keep them quiet. I said, oh, there's brain science behind that, because you're in parallel and you're creating rhythm and repetition of that transport, that car moving. It provides great opportunity for that co-regulation, and you can learn a lot. So these are important strategies to consider when you're looking at how do you manage your stress. So these are signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma. I think that Danielle's going to put some resources in the chat about some actual kind of assessments that you can do, which is awesome. So I really want you to take some time to do that, because as you look through this list, we talked about this before with that other slide, that these are all things and signs that, this work's getting to you. And you really need to be able to think about how you can use some of those skills of resilience. How do you build those into a self-regulation plan, right? How do you make sure you're staying connected with others? How do you make sure that you give your time for rhythm and repetition? How do you make sure that you are doing those things to build your hope, right? So these are just those signs and symptoms to look for. Difficult managing your emotions, accepting or feeling okay about yourself, making good decisions, problems managing the boundaries between yourself and others, taking on too much responsibility, having difficulty leaving work at the end of the day, trying to step in and control others' lives, problems in relationships, physical problems. Sometimes this catches us off guard. But if we're having lots of aches and pains and illnesses and accidents, it might really be related to vicarious trauma. Difficulty feeling connected to what's going on around you and within you, loss of meaning and hope. So pay attention, do some of those assessments, and then take time. Take time to think about what your self-care plan is, right? Think about those skills of resilience. How do you build those into your day? That's been really helpful for me. I had somebody ask me, how do you do this work continually? It's pretty difficult. And I said, yeah, it is. But when I thought about those skills, I utilize them every day, right? I walk that damn dog five times a day. I have lots of rhythm and repetition with him. I like to bake. That has a lot of rhythm and repetition. And I golf every weekend. Now that can create stress too, but I have great connections. I'm very connected with people and I utilize that, right? I'm good at being able to say, yeah, I did that. I was awesome at that. So I celebrate my wins. So think about how you can put those to place to really develop your own plan of how you can manage your stress. It's important. We care about you. We want you to take care of you. Mental preparedness for crisis response and how to manage feeling activated in the field. We talked a little bit about this, right? Be aware that response and range of severity varies for everyone. What activates your stress response may not activate a coworker's. So you know what, you need to have grace and be really thoughtful with one another and not have people have an expectation they're going to respond like you. Trauma reduces your window of tolerance. So I talked about being irritable, being snappy, right? Those are all signs. And then develop your own action plan. I just mentioned how important that really is. Do things intentionally that will build those skills of resilience.
And I think for a lot of people, especially on teams, getting to know your team members, getting to really understand who they are, what makes them tick, what their likes are, because that's part of being on that team, is so that way you know if something's going on in their life. Y'all are responding to a lot of things together, and so if they're bringing in something from life, then you have to understand of like, okay, maybe I need to put more of the focus somewhere else because something's going on in their own life, so that way y'all can help lean it like in a partnership.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. And this is that slide that really talks about how important it is to support your team and yourself. You work in teams for a reason. Rely on other people's strengths. You know, you aren't expected to know it all. So be able to reach out, get support from one another, get support from your supervisor, you know, have a check-in system. You know, I think that after every crisis call, there should be a little opportunity to debrief. How did we do? What did we do right? Right? Start out with that strength-based approach. What went really well on this call? And then we kind of can get to things, what might we have done better? But start out with that strength and have a wellness plan, right? And I think it's important to even think about team wellness plans. What do you do to really increase everybody's wellness?
So for us, we saw something that we would have slower time periods during days. So that time would be there for if we wanted to have parties with one another, if we wanted every Friday at this certain time, we would all sit down and eat together, things like that.
Yeah, because again, connections are so important. So it's not just, you know, we need to foster those connections within our team. So these are staying healthy at work, workday health habits. And remember, you're going to get these slides. So I'm going through these last ones fast because I think I'm out of time. So these are other things that we can do. And some of this you may not have control over. This might be your leadership that have control, you know, flexible schedules, maybe really implementing those check-ins and things. Just food for thought to think about a multidisciplinary mobile crisis team, How does knowledge of trauma, resilience, and the inclusion of those with lived experience support the person in crisis? So it's a question to leave you with, to think about, consider those things. I really hope that you'll look back through this PowerPoint to kind of land on these Let's Talk slides and really give some considerations to those. It'd be a great opportunity for teams to work on some of those Let's Talk slides together and think about how, what some of the answers to these questions might be.
And as we look at any kind of questions, any kind of, as you implement peers in your mobile crisis outreach team, feel free to put any kind of questions that you guys might have to ask me in how to incorporate that.
I think that we're done with the slide presentation.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much, Eve, just for sharing your expertise and experience, and Ariana, just for sharing your lived experience in so many different parts of the training, and just really making all those connections. Really appreciate the both of you and just everything that you brought to the table. There was so much rich engagement happening in the chat as well, and it was really awesome to see some of the points and some of the feedback and the agreement with a lot of the things that you were both saying, and just seeing the sparks flying, and like someone said, light bulb light bulb moment. And so really appreciate that. We are I'm not sure, Ariana, if you were going to share another story or anything from your own experiences and perspective. And we can also open up for questions as well. And so any questions you might have, feel free to come off mute or raise your hand so that we can call on you through the reactions option. You can also place your questions in the chat as well. And I'll hand it to you, Ariana.
Sure. So I would say, from my own lived experience in working with mobile crisis outreach teams, being a peer inside of it, sometimes it could be a lot of triggering work, but I knew that I had my clinical team that I could reach out to at any time. You have to kind of be gentle with peers, because not always do they have the same clinical training that you guys might have. So some things that I recognized in the field where I would get on a scene and I might not understand what schizophrenia symptoms might look like. And I would reach out to a clinical member and say, hey, I don't understand what these things are going on. Would you spend time with me to make me comprehend what I just saw and what I just witnessed? And so really that debriefing moment was really impactful for me to learn more of some things that might not be in my own lived experience. We had 2 people that were peers with us. And so we each had our own strengths that we brought to the team. For me, I have criminal justice impact, I have substance use, and I also have mental health diagnosis. So I came from a lot of different aspects where my team would ask me a lot about the criminal justice system and how they could incorporate better lenses when interacting with people that have backgrounds.
I think that's such a great point that you just mentioned, Ariana, especially as we here in California move towards those multidisciplinary teams for mobile crisis response, utilizing community health workers, peers, first responders, clinicians, and really being creative about how we connect to folks in the community, and really working and employing folks from the community, right, who represent and look like the community. That's so important. When I saw so many times people in the chat talk about building rapport and trust. And when we don't have people who look like us or who can relate to our experiences, it's really hard to connect, right? And someone else had mentioned the distrust that builds up across systems, right, in the mental health system and the healthcare system. And so being able to reframe that for folks, or show them a different side of care and what care can look like, especially when they're in crisis. And like Eve said, their world feels like it has fallen apart in that moment, and they feel so lost and out of control. We can be that grounding piece for them, or support them and show them that it will pass, right?
Right.
And I really appreciate that level of experience and what you're sharing from your own experiences, your own lived experiences. That's great.
And I can even say with my boss, like that was the first question she had. She was like, well, how am I supposed to employ somebody with all this lived experience? And it was a learning curve for both of us to figure out like where we needed peers, where they were most effective in teaching the clinicians their role as well and who they are. And so what we found helpful is we would have like team meetings every quarter so often to kind of share the peers experience and their story and what led them to work with the team.
I was going to say, I think it's important to really think about what peer expertise can bring to a team. I've been doing some work with some peers in Louisiana, and when we would do some role plays, it was a mixed crowd, and folks would kind of try to bring some mirroring and some opportunities to calm, right? So where was some rhythm and repetition? And one thing that would frequently come up is that some of the clinicians would say, okay, well, just breathe, just take breaths. And I'll never forget that the peer was like, oh, that pisses me off. She says, I hate it when somebody tells me to just breathe. And it was a great opportunity to say, look, then you can use mirroring. You just take some deep breaths. You don't have to say it. Just take some deep breaths and watch to see if other people will begin to mirror you. You can say it in other ways. So that was awesome because she was very clear about what really irritated her when she was escalated. And so we get an opportunity to use that expertise to our advantage.
Well, so one of the ways I could show that is I used to go to law enforcement and a law officer, he says, well, I just don't get it. They shut down, they stop talking, and I can't get anything out of them at this point. And I said, well, you're in a correctional facility still, correct? And he said, well, yeah. And I said, why don't you just take them as they're being released? Like that's whenever you can speak, because of course you're going to shut down in correctional facilities. You're going to go into that fight or flight because it's unpredictable situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's what you just said, Eve, about mirroring and, it's the doorway or the pathway to that co-regulation, which is, I mean, and a lot of trauma modalities too that clinicians use or, other practitioners use, co-regulation and attunement is the biggest piece of it. And so if we're out in the field, in live, in action, being able to facilitate that co-regulation and that attunement with the person in crisis is so important and so helpful in regulating the nervous system. And like you said, Eve, being able to bring down all of those levels. And so I appreciate that very much. I know when I was out in the field as a mobile crisis responder, and this was, we responded individually. So just a one person response, unless, law enforcement was necessary due to safety concerns. It was challenging at times to make sure that like I'm regulating myself and I'm also working towards helping this other person in crisis regulate and come down. And so it can be challenging.
I could only imagine because some of the best work that I've done with teams is when one can step away and especially if we need to call law enforcement, so the person doesn't catch that, hey, this is escalating too much, that the safety has become so aggressive that one can just say, hey, I'm going to step out and make a phone call at this point. And it keeps the safety of all the people on there as well.
Yeah. I'm just checking the chat. I see Carla agrees with Ariana. When you see things outside of what you are used to based on personal experiences or non-lived experience, it's a lot of learning in the moment. Absolutely. And that can dysregulate you, right? That can kind of throw you off your game per se, because you're trying to understand what's happening and take in this new information, and it can be a lot and overwhelming. Great point, Carla. Don't see any other questions in the chat. I know many folks have asked about the PowerPoint, and I just do want to let everyone know that it will be emailed out to all participants at some point, shortly after the training. And the recording for this training will also be available on the website, which we put the link into the chat. I'm scanning for any hands, any potential hands up. Anyone have any questions or comments? Anyone already seeing the value of incorporating peers and having this multidisciplinary team in their own counties, and just seeing that value add, and any trends that they've seen in their own counties and their own programs? Anyone want to share? I see.
It says, with the integration of peers, is there a training for managers and supervisors how to provide the best supportive supervision to peers as they come into the team? For any of you that have led it, Eve, have you integrated? Do you have any tips that you could offer?
I think that to recognize that I don't know that I've used any special techniques of supervision with peers that I've used with any, right? Because I see them as an expert in a field that I don't have that experience in. And so I think that's one way to approach it, is to really believe that, just provide the support that you would with any staff member, right? That you do check-ins, that you give them voice and choice. Just like we do with the folks that we're working with, that we make sure that when we're inviting them to meetings, that it's relevant to what they are doing, and that we really give opportunities and think about ways that we can bring some predictability. The biggest thing that I tell folks about supervision that I think is crucial is that I think supervision should follow an agenda that happens the same way every time. Because then your folks have predictability about what's going to happen. So I start every meeting, every supervision that I do, I start with, tell me what's gone right with your week. So that we really start from that strength-based. I'm modeling that for them, and I start out with that. And then I talk about, so I might talk about, was there a particular content that you struggled with this week, or that was really, you felt you implemented really well, especially as it relates to this new information that we're bringing to the table. How did you do with that person-centered approach? Give me some examples of how that worked. So that would be the next. Then I would have them really give me an example of how they responded in a particular situation. Give me the story. How did that case go? I know you went out on this call, so tell me about that. And then, so again, the agenda is the same every single time, so that folks have predictability about what I'm going to ask and what we're going to discuss. Shouldn't be any anxiety from them because they don't know what the next question will be.
I agree. And I also agree on having one clinical supervisor and then one peer supervisor as well, somebody who has lived experience in doing that role, especially in moments of frustration that have they experienced certain things because of not having the education? Have they experienced the things of not having the degree, of having to break things down a little bit more simpler? I think some ways that I really found effective also when talking with kind of squirrel on that, like law enforcement, of breaking down our wording is some people might say like a clinical term I heard a lot was, oh, the person is having, why did I just blank whenever you're decompensating, that's the word. Thank you. I quickly got it. When the person is decompensating. So a lot of people will say that in the mental health field and say like it's a normal thing to say. And it's like, no, you have to explain what decompensation is to somebody. You have to explain to officers like they're having decompensation so that way they can't use daily life functions. They can't do these things. And that's why it's important to help take them to better safety. So like wording and jargon is important to teach peers as well. The shorthands as well. Things like DX I remember taking to my clinical supervisor and being like, what is DX? And she was like, oh, it's diagnosis. Things like that is just having helpful tips for them along the way.
Yeah, I really appreciate both your comments. And one thing I heard in one of our listening sessions a while back was the importance of, when you get the clinical teams, traditionally we have our group supervision as we're going through our progression, and that's scheduled. Like you have your individual supervision and then your 2-hour group supervision. But ensuring that that is implemented or provided to peers as well, because they are experts and they're actually doing the work. And I thought that was just a very profound comment to do that, and make sure that for those that are in leadership to go back to that question, that we take the time to ensure that we provide that place for them to grow and support, and use that plain language that Ariana and Eve just both suggested, to break down some of those more clinical subjects that are palatable for everyone to just absorb and learn. So great comments, everyone.
I think it's important to also, really model how to give feedback and how to receive it. Right? It's
Mhm.
not always, we need to be open to receiving feedback. And so that's really an important skill to learn. It helps us when we hear if there's language that's offensive, we need to be open to hearing that. I know I was talking with a physician, and I was talking about a baby that had been in the NICU after being born with substances. And I said the baby was born addicted. And she said, nope, nope, nope. That baby was born dependent on substances, but not addicted, because an addicted is a DSM diagnosis. I was like, thank you. So now I get to correct everybody else. But it was being open to it, not being offended by her pointing that language out to me, but being able to say, I really appreciate you saying that, and really educating me.
And I think one of my favorite ones that I've done with my boss was the criminal justice involvement. A lot of people did not understand what it meant to when somebody says, oh, I've had criminal justice involvement. It means that I've been arrested. It means that I've been incarcerated. And that was a better term than inmate or things like that used. And so whenever I heard her use that in explaining what my background meant, I was so proud of her one day. And I said, yes, like you, she goes, did I use that correctly? I said, yes, you did.
Actually, Jacob was asking about the training, and Bethany did share that Cal Mesa does have a good peer supervision training. And, in the state of California, with peers becoming certified and able to bill Medi-Cal now through the certification process or the credentialing process, there is that requirement for supervision. So I did post a link to the available training for peer supervision. And it is, considered a best practice, like what Ariana said, having that clinical supervisor as well as a peer supervisor. And even what Eve said about, having consistency, routine, and structure around supervision is so important too. And again, this was number 2 of the core required trainings, trauma-informed care, for the new Medi-Cal benefit. And so we will be releasing shortly as well a kind of calendar for the rest of the summer that highlights the upcoming training dates. We are hoping to get better at giving you more time to register for these as well, as we partner with DHCS as well. So it was really great to have you all here. A huge thank you to Eve and Ariana for presenting such valuable information and just sharing your knowledge and expertise and your experiences. Very much appreciate your vulnerability and your ability to share, and just your time. So thank you so much, and really appreciate you all being here. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.